What if quieting a single habit could free months of your life and finally push you past the noise? In this video, we break down purposeful focus into sharp, practical moves that stop distractions from stealing your days and turn scattered energy into unstoppable momentum. Stay until the end. I'll give you a 15-second ritual that resets your attention instantly and a one-line planning trick that makes your next 90 minutes your most productive. Yet, Chapter 1, the moment your mind slips away. The mind never loses focus in a dramatic collapse. It slips quietly the same way a small crack spreads across glass until the entire window trembles. In this chapter, we follow that silent crack inside you the moment your attention drifts without your permission. Imagine you sit at your desk ready to conquer an important task when suddenly your hand reaches for your phone without a conscious decision. You only meant to check one message, but your mind falls into a tunnel of scrolling and noise. Time evaporates. You look up and you cannot explain where the last 30 minutes went. This is not a failure of discipline. It is your brain reacting to constant stimulation until distraction becomes automatic. The author explains that every human carries a hidden script formed by micro-habits that shape attention without us noticing. These small behaviors become routines, and routines become identity. If the identity accepts distraction as normal, you will always feel pulled in every direction. You begin each day with ambition, then end it feeling behind. The chapter shares the story of a woman named Mara who believed she had a motivation problem. She woke early to read and work on her business ideas, but found herself trapped in an endless loop of checking notifications. She blamed herself for lack of willpower until she realized she was fighting a system designed to break her focus. When she removed visual triggers from her environment, like placing her phone in another room and reducing digital noise, her mind slowly returned to her. This transformation was not sudden. It was a rewiring that happened when she replaced automatic distraction with automatic intention. The chapter reveals the first truth of purposeful focus. Your environment is stronger than your motivation. People often expect themselves to battle temptations through pure discipline, but the brain does not operate that way. It follows cues. Remove the cue and the distraction loses its power. The author invites you to notice the exact second your mind wanders, not after the distraction consumes you, the precise second before. When you catch this micro moment, you begin to reclaim authority over your thoughts. You begin to understand that focus is not built through force, but through awareness. The chapter closes with a visual exercise where you imagine your attention as a beam of light. Wherever that beam rests becomes your reality. If it flickers, your life flickers. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Attention. The battle for your attention is not a moral failing, it is an architectural problem. And this chapter takes you inside the rooms of your mind to redesign them. Imagine your day as a house with open doors. Every open door invites noise. Every closed door protects work that matters. The author tells the story of Omar, who believed he lacked focus because he would start projects and then drift to easier tasks. He learned that his workflow was literally built for distraction. His email pings were set to constant. His browser had dozens of tabs that became visual anchors for attention, and his workspace was crowded with objects that triggered unrelated tasks. When he reorganized, he created a simple ritual: a single agenda on a sticky note, a closed browser with one tab for the task, and a 5-minute pre-session ritual of breath and a short intention sentence. This physical and ritual architecture transformed his ability to sustain attention not by improving willpower, but by changing input. The chapter introduces the idea of attention scaffolding. You scaffold a difficult mental task by reducing the number of simultaneous demands until the brain can apply full resources to a single focus. You do this through environmental edits, scheduled attention blocks, and micro-habits that nudge your nervous system toward depth. The author explains that deep work emerges when you cluster similar cognitive demands and give your mind a clear boundary for the work you want it to do. He gives practical experiments used by busy professionals. Block calendars into 90-minute focus sessions, remove notifications for those blocks, and use a simple visual timer to create urgency without pressure. Chapter 3. The currency of energy. Attention is held hostage not just by distraction, but by depleted energy. And this chapter reframes focus as a function of biological and psychological currency. The author opens with a morning in the life of Seema, a teacher who loved her work but found afternoons impossible for concentrated tasks. She realized that her focus collapsed at predictable times because she was spending cognitive energy on minor decisions, emotional noise, and poor nutrition. The book maps out the energy ledger, what you invest, what you conserve, and what yields return. There are practical levers to manage energy like a portfolio. Prioritize high-value, cognitive tasks for times when your energy is naturally high. For many people, that means the morning hours before email and social demands intrude. Reserve low-energy windows for mechanical work that requires less creative bandwidth. Seema experimented with batching decisions and found her afternoons freed up when she pre-planned outfits, meals, and small logistic choices in the morning. The chapter also emphasizes recovery investments. Short naps, movement breaks, hydration, and sunlight are not indulgences. They are strategic deposits into your attention account. The author shares research on ultradian rhythms and explains why 90-minute cycles of focused work followed by a deliberate recharge deliver far more creative output than continuous 8-hour grinding. You will find vivid stories of professionals who reclaimed hours by treating energy management as their priority rather than time slicing. Emotional energy is addressed as well. Unresolved interpersonal tensions and chronic worry are heavy drains that silently reduce your capacity to focus. The text provides a simple emotional hygiene practice. Spend 5 minutes each evening writing down the 3 things you completed and 1 small corrective action for tomorrow. This ritual reduces mental rumination and lowers the cognitive tax of worry. Nutrition advice is pragmatic, not a diet lecture, but a focus on steady fuel that prevents energy crashes. Protein, hydration, and small, balanced meals keep the brain in a workable state. The chapter refuses to moralize about willpower. It reframes the conversation. When you manage energy first, you multiply your capacity to focus second. The final narrative moves into systems that protect energy over weeks and months, including sleep hygiene and boundaries for emotional labor. Seema's life changes because she stopped blaming herself, began tracking energy patterns, and designed daily micro-investments that compounded into creative sustainability. By the end of this chapter, you will understand that the secret to sustained focus lies in tending your energy as diligently as you tend your calendar. Chapter 4. Intentional attention and the power of why. Focus without purpose is effort without direction, and this chapter draws a direct line from clarity of intent to stamina of attention. It begins with a simple but powerful exercise experienced by a man named Luis, who was drowning in tasks without meaning. he decided to ask one question each morning before work. What one thing this week will make the month different? That question transformed how he prioritized. Intent sharpens the mind because it provides the brain with a narrative worth sustaining. The author explains that attention follows significance. The brain conserves effort for things that matter to identity and survival. If your goals are ambiguous, your mind will not defend them against the lure of distraction. Purposeful focus is therefore intentionally created. Define outcomes that matter, articulate the why, and break the outcome into a chain of visible actions. Luis used visible artifacts to keep purpose alive. He wrote one sentence on an index card that captured his weekly mission and kept it by his computer. He reported that the card pulled him back from scrolling and gossip because it reframed the immediate decision. Is this action consistent with my one sentence? The chapter introduces the concept of micro goals and narrative stitches. Micro goals are the atoms of progress that produce dopamine when completed and thus sustain motivation. Narrative stitches are short stories you tell yourself about why the work matters, who it helps, and what the future looks like. The author tells the story of teams who used public narrative stitches in the form of a single-sentence mission displayed in the meeting room. Those teams showed higher resilience under pressure because the public narrative reduced ambiguity and aligned micro-decisions. Purposeful attention also requires boundary rituals. When you know why you focus, you more easily decline low-value requests because the cost becomes visible in lost progress toward the mission. The chapter teaches a practical dialogue for declining that keeps relationships intact while preserving focus. Instead of blunt refusal, you say a short, honest sentence that acknowledges the request and aligns it with your priorities. The text emphasizes rehearsal. Intent is fragile and must be rehearsed through morning rituals, weekly reviews, and visible reminders. Luis's weekly card, Seema's energy plan, and Omar's environment edits are all examples of how small, repeated acts keep purpose active. The chapter closes with a mental rehearsal practice. Spend 60 seconds imagining the future you want that is consistent with your purpose and feel the small sensations associated with achieving it. That sensorial detail makes the future plausible and draws attention toward actions that construct it. Purpose without practice is just aspiration. Practice without purpose is empty toil. Combine them and your focus becomes purposeful and unstoppable. Chapter 5. Rituals that anchor attention. Rituals convert intention into habit because they automate the decision to begin and the decision to persist. And this chapter lays out the design of rituals that anchor attention in daily life. The narrative opens with Amina, a consultant who struggled with starting her deep work sessions because the threshold always felt high. She designed a 5-step entry ritual that took less than 2 minutes, and it changed everything. The ritual began with closing the browser, putting the phone face down, breathing 2 full breaths, reading aloud a 1-line intention, and then starting a 30-minute session on a single task. The repetition removed friction and prevented the justification stories that previously kept her from starting. The author explains the science behind rituals. They create predictable neurochemical sequences in the brain, moving a person from wandering mode into focused mode by associating specific cues with work. Over time, the cues become sufficient to trigger attention. The chapter details how to design rituals for different contexts: short rituals for quick tasks, longer rituals for deep creative work, and social rituals that coordinate focus across teams. There are examples of companies that adopted opening rituals for meetings that replaced chaotic back and forth with a 60-second centering practice and a shared one-sentence aim. Those teams experience shorter meetings and clearer decisions because attention was anchored at the start. The chapter also warns against overcomplicated rituals that require perfect execution. The goal is reliability, not ceremony. Keep rituals simple, repeatable, and forgiving. A missed step is not a failure. The ritual is a scaffold, not a test. Rituals also aid transition. The author offers an evening ritual to close the cognitive day. A 3-question review where you note one win, one learning, and one micro-plan for tomorrow. This ritual reduces rumination and creates a clear cognitive handoff to rest. The book provides practical templates for building your own rituals. Start with one tiny ritual linked to a current routine, such as brushing your teeth or making coffee, and attach a single intention statement to it. Test for 1 week and adjust. The narrative shows how tiny rituals compound. Amina's 2-minute routine yielded 30 minutes of deep work daily, which multiplied into deep projects completed monthly. Rituals are not magic, but they are reliable infrastructure for attention. Chapter 6, The Team Rhythm That Protects. Focus. Focus is often mistaken for a solo virtue, but the truth is attention lives inside social systems, and this chapter shows how groups either amplify distraction or shield work that matters. Imagine a team where every meeting feels urgent and every message demands an instant reply. In that environment, focus is taxed before individual willpower has a chance to act. The author tells the story of a small design team that was brilliant in bursts but burned out by context switching. They tried preaching discipline and failed because the structure and norms of their work rewarded speed over depth. Their transformation began when they redesigned their rhythm. They created visible meeting rules, synchronized deep work blocks, and introduced a simple signal that meant "do not interrupt." The signal was not a law, but a ritual that reduced noise and created collective permission to concentrate. Practical moves in the chapter include aligning calendars so that core hours are sacred across the group, setting clear expectations for response times, and using short written asynchronous updates to replace some meetings. The narrative gives examples of teams that reclaim days by clustering collaboration into tight windows and protecting long, uninterrupted stretches for individual problem solving. Psychological safety is crucial. When people fear being out of the loop, they will check constantly. The antidote is predictable communication rhythms and brief check-ins that provide reassurance without habitually fragmenting attention. Chapter 7. The Quiet Smartphone Revolution. The pocket device that promised convenience became the great devourer of time. And this chapter walks through a practical revolution to reclaim attention without abandoning modern life. The story begins with Tariq, who found his evenings swallowed by fragments of content and urgent noise. He assumed he lacked resolve until he experimented with radical clarity rather than moralizing willpower. He did not throw away his phone. He redesigned its role. He created app boundaries, moved social apps off his home screen, and configured a small handful of exceptions for true emergencies. The change was not about deprivation, but about curating input. The author explains the neuroscience of intermittent rewards and why notifications hijack the dopamine system. The practical toolkit includes turning off non-critical alerts, batching social media time, and using a simple focus mode that limits access to only task-relevant apps during work sessions. The narrative offers gentle experiments rather than rigid rules. One experiment asks you to keep your phone in another room for 2 hours each workday and to log whether deep work quality improved. Most people find the first day awkward, then notice clarity rising over a week. Another section explores email architecture. Instead of triage mode where every message demands an instant reply, create a rhythm of scheduled checks and short template replies that buy time. The chapter shows how small structural changes reduce decision fatigue and protect the slow thinking required for important work. The author also addresses social pressure. People fear missing out or appearing rude when they delay responses. Counter that fear by setting expectations publicly. A short message that describes your deep work hours and preferred response window reduces anxiety and increases mutual respect. The book refuses techno-asceticism. It advocates intentional use rather than blanket rejection. The smartphone returns to being a tool and not a tyrant. By curating inputs and designing simple, forgiving experiments, you will find that your attention becomes a manageable asset rather than a constantly depleted liability. Chapter 8. Creativity in Constrained Spaces. Constraint is not the enemy of creativity, and this chapter reframes limits as the engine of original work. The author begins with the story of a photographer who had less gear than peers, yet produced the most striking images because constraint forced him to deepen choices rather than multiply them. The chapter teaches how to design constraints that create focus and stimulate creative problem-solving. Constraints can be temporal, such as short, intense sprints, material, such as limited tools, or procedural, such as fixed routines that channel exploration into productive paths. The practical guidance asks you to choose one dominant constraint for a creative project and to defend it for a fixed period. Artists, entrepreneurs, and writers often find clarity when they restrict options and commit to depth. The chapter provides exercises that force specificity. One exercise asks you to write a short piece with a single sensory focus, ignoring all other details. Another invites designers to build a prototype with only 3 materials. These micro-constraints reduce the paralysis that comes from boundless possibility and invite iteration. The author highlights the role of incubation. Deep work produces raw material, but creative breakthroughs often surface after a period of rest when subconscious processing stitches ideas together. Respect that cycle and schedule slack time intentionally. The chapter also counsels against mistaken perfectionism. Early work should be small and cheap to produce. Cheap is strategic because it allows many more attempts. The narrative includes case studies of teams that launched dozens of prototypes, learned quickly, and found one idea worth scaling. Creativity thrives in disciplined freedom where structure provides enough limitation to focus energy and enough space to play. When you master constraints, you will produce elegant solutions faster and sustain the joy that fuels continued exploration. Chapter 9. Weathering Setbacks and Reclaiming Momentum. Purposeful focus will be tested by failure, and this chapter describes how to fail, forward, and retrieve attention after disruption. The author tells the story of a startup founder whose product launch failed spectacularly. Her instinct was to collapse into blame and distraction. She learned a different move, which is core to this book. Stop the narrative of catastrophe and convert the setback into a micro-experiment. Break the failure into observable data points, choose one small corrective action, and schedule a short test. This method prevents rumination and restores agency. The chapter offers practical emotional practices to stabilize attention when the world goes sideways. Simple grounding techniques such as paced breathing, a brief physical routine, and a 5-minute writing exercise that names controllable next steps reduce the cognitive load of distress. The author introduces the idea of attention triage, which prioritizes 3 actions: stabilize, simplify, and test. Stabilize is about immediate calming moves. Simplify is about reducing the complexity of choices to essentials. And test is about a quick probe that begins learning. The narrative also explores the social dimension of recovery. Supportive, honest conversations with trusted peers accelerate repair, but public venting without plan prolongs distraction. The chapter teaches a structure for conversations after failure that combine empathy with inquiry and end with one small forward step. Finally, the chapter reframes resilience as a design problem, not a moral badge. Build routines that anticipate setbacks such as buffer time, reserve resources, and simple fallback rituals. So when disruption arrives, you have pre-made responses that protect your attention. Recovery becomes a practiced skill rather than a matter of luck. Chapter 10. The long game of purposeful focus and a short conclusion. Sustaining focus across years requires a life design that balances ambition with renewal, and this final chapter ties the book together with practices that compound over time. The author profiles people who sustained creative careers for decades and finds common patterns. They scheduled seasons for intense output and seasons for learning. They treated focus as a long-lived muscle that needed progressive overload and rest. Practical designs include yearly themes that guide priorities, quarterly focus projects that translate themes into execution, and weekly rituals that protect the smallest units of work. The chapter asks you to create a simple 3-part plan for the next year that names 1 theme, 3 quarterly projects, and a daily ritual that anchors progress. The book ends with a short invitation to experimentation. Try the smallest change that could matter and iterate fast. The conclusion is clear and humane. Purposeful focus is not a perfect state, but a practiced way of living that increases meaning and reduces noise. Begin with environment edits, tend your energy, craft rituals, protect shared attention, design constraints that foster creativity, and build recovery systems for setbacks. Over months, these small moves compound into sustained momentum. The last line is an encouragement. The life you imagine is the result of attention well kept. Start small and keep the beam of your mind steady.